November 1963, Bayonne, New Jersey. An inspector climbs a storage tank that's supposed to hold millions of dollars of vegetable oil. He drops a sample tube through the hatch. It comes up oil, exactly like the paperwork says. Then he opens a second hatch. Seawater, almost the entire tank. The collateral behind more than $180 million in loans is seawater. 3 days after Wall Street finds out, the President of the United States is shot, and the biggest fraud in American history vanishes from the front page. How does a man borrow a fortune against water? And why did nobody look? This is the Con Ledger, case file number 1. To understand how seawater ends up backing 9 figures of Wall Street money, you need to meet the man who filled the tanks. Anthony Tino De Angelis, born in the Bronx in 1915, the son of Italian immigrants. He left school for the meat markets, and by his teens, he was running a crew of 200 men. 200. Most teenagers can't run a paper route. Picture him, short, round, balding, soft-spoken. Nobody's sketch of a Wall Street villain. But Tino had 2 gifts. He was very, very good with numbers, and men liked working for him. By all accounts, he paid over the odds, remembered names, and handed out favors the way other men handed out business cards. File that away. The loyalty of Tino's men will matter more than any number in this story. In the early 1950s, he took over a meatpacking company called Adolf Goebel and won a contract with the brand new federal school lunch program. His first taste of government money. It went exactly how the rest of this story goes. He overcharged the government $31,000 on meat and shipped more than 2 million pounds of uninspected meat to school children. By 1953, Goebel was bankrupt, and Tino was out. His name poisoned to every bank in New York. Most men would be finished. Tino walked away with a lesson instead. The checkers check the paperwork, not the product. Burn that sentence in. It's the genome of everything that comes next. So in 1955, Tino bought a rundown petroleum tank farm on the Bayonne, New Jersey waterfront, acres of rusting steel, catwalks, and pipe, and founded a company with a gloriously boring name, Allied Crude Vegetable Oil Refining. The business plan was real, and it was clever. Post-war Europe and Asia were hungry, and Washington wanted American farm surpluses shipped overseas, subsidized through the government's Food for Peace program. Allied would buy soybean and cottonseed oil from Midwest crushers, store it at Bayonne, and ship it out to the world. Uncle Sam subsidized the exports, foreign buyers got cheap American oil, and Allied collected in the middle. On paper, a patriot, feeding the hungry with American crops at a discount. On paper, remember that phrase. Because here's what everyone forgets about this fraud. Part of it was real. Real tankers docked at Bayonne. Real oil moved through those pipes, more than 100 million pounds of it. Customers got their shipments. Ships sailed. Invoices were paid. Tino worked brutal hours, undercut every competitor, and muscled Allied into the middle of the American oil export trade. Which raised a question his rivals never could answer. How? His prices were too low. His volumes were too big. The margins made no sense. Some competitors shrugged and whispered that the mob had to be bankrolling him. The truth was stranger. Allied didn't need to make money. It needed to make paper. Exporting oil eats cash. You pay for the oil months before any buyer pays you. That means loans, big ones. And banks do not lend big to a man whose last company shipped uninspected meat to schools. Tino couldn't build a reputation in time, so he rented one. In the early 60s, American Express was arguably the most trusted name in American money. The traveler's check in every suitcase, the green card in every executive's wallet, an entire business model resting on a single promise: our paper is good. And tucked inside that company was a small, awkward subsidiary most shareholders had never heard of: American Express Field Warehousing. Its job was to act as a neutral referee, take custody of a borrower's inventory, count it, guard it, certify it, so banks could lend against the certificates. One problem: the division had been underperforming for years. A chronic disappointment wearing a 5-star name, under pressure to finally turn a profit. And right then, the perfect customer walked through the door, a man with enormous inventory, an endless appetite for loans, and no complaints about the fees. Allied became the warehousing division's biggest customer, worth as much as $20,000 a week in fees. The embarrassing little unit suddenly had a future, and that future had exactly one name on it. And when your biggest client is the reason your division finally matters, scrutiny gets expensive. So American Express took over the tanks at Bayonne, put its name on the gate, staffed the site with inspectors, and began issuing warehouse receipts carrying the most trusted signature in America. Tino no longer needed credit. He had something infinitely better. He had American Express vouching for whatever he said was in the tanks. Now, here's the machine, step by step, and I promise, by the end of this section, you could run it yourself. Step 1. Tino fills a tank in Bayonne, or says he does. Step 2. The referee, American Express Field Warehousing, inspects the tank and issues a warehouse receipt, an official certificate declaring that so many million pounds of oil exist in that tank under Amex custody. In 1963, a warehouse receipt with that name on it is as good as cash. The banks don't need to see the oil, they can see the signature. Think of it as a coat check ticket for commodities. Nobody lends against a coat they can't see, but everybody lends against the ticket if they trust the cloakroom. Step 3. Tino pledges the receipts as collateral. Banks and brokers hand over cash. Step 4. The flywheel. The cash buys more oil, which fills more tanks, which generates more receipts, which secure more loans. Around and around. Every turn of the wheel, the paper multiplies. By the end, 51 companies were holding Allied's paper or exposed to it. Bank of America, Bank Leumi, export houses, 2 of Wall Street's proudest brokerage firms. And not one of those 51 institutions ever sent a man onto a catwalk in Bayonne to put a dipstick in a tank. Why would they? Verifying the collateral was the referee's whole job. That's the entire point of a referee, so nobody else has to check. Which means a field warehousing system doesn't have 51 locks protecting it. It has one. And that left just one problem. The oil had to actually exist. It didn't. Not most of it anyway. The tanks at Bayonne were plumbed like a stage magician's cabinet. Many were filled with seawater pumped in from the harbor, with a few feet of soybean oil floating on top. Because oil floats, and inspectors sampled from the top hatch. Drop the tube, pull up gold, sign the certificate. Some tanks held a nastier trick, a narrow metal chamber welded directly beneath the inspection hatch, a steel test tube hidden inside the tank, holding just enough clean oil to fool a sample, while everything around it was water. And the tanks were connected. While an inspection team worked its way across the farm, Tino's crews pumped the same batch of real oil through the pipes, one step ahead of the clipboards. So a single pool of oil could be counted twice, 3 times, 5 times. And when even that grew too slow for Tino's ambitions, Allied dropped the theatrics and simply forged receipts outright, typed the forms, invented the numbers. So let's put the paper next to the truth. By the end, Allied's receipts certified 1.8 billion pounds of oil. The real figure was about 110 million, 6% real, 94% faith. But here's the number that should genuinely make you angry. Those receipts claim more soybean oil than existed in the entire United States. Not more than New Jersey, the whole country. Say it plainly. To believe Allied's paper, you had to believe one tank farm in New Jersey held more soybean oil than every tank, silo, and refinery in America combined. That's not an accounting error. That's a confession, published monthly. And no one needed a subpoena to see it. The government's national stock figures were public. Any banker, any broker, any clerk with a newspaper could have laid the 2 numbers side by side. 1 phone call to Washington, 10 minutes of arithmetic. The whole empire falls over. Nobody made the call. And once you learn why nobody made it, you'll stop asking how Tino fooled the system and start asking whether the system wanted to be fooled. Because here's the ugliest mechanism of all. The referees, inspectors, the men in American Express jackets walking those catwalks. Where do you think they came from? When American Express took over the Bayonne operation, it hired site staff straight out of Allied's own workforce. Tino's men, the crews he'd paid over the odds for years. Same faces, new badge. And according to the reporting that later won a Pulitzer Prize, Tino simply kept paying them, not petty bribes, real money on top of their American Express wages. Sit with that for a second. The men certifying the oil were on the payroll of the man inventing it. And if you're thinking surely someone, somewhere, raised an alarm, someone did. In 1960, 3 years before the collapse, an anonymous caller warned American Express that the Bayonne tanks were full of water. Not a hunch. The actual mechanism handed over for free. Inspectors drove out, climbed the ladders, dropped their tubes through the one hatch Tino had built for them, found nothing wrong, closed the file. Hold on to that phone call. This entire story ends with it. So Tino now owns a machine that turns seawater into money. Why does a man with a perfect machine blow it up? Because the loans were never the endgame. Tino didn't want to borrow against the vegetable oil market. He wanted to be the vegetable oil market. Quick sidebar, 30 seconds. Because this is where the leverage lives. A futures contract is a promise to buy oil months from now at a price you lock in today. You don't pay the full amount up front. You post a small deposit called margin, a few cents on the dollar, which means a little cash controls a lot of oil. If prices rise, that little cash multiplies. If prices fall, the broker calls, and you top up the deposit immediately in cash. Remember that phone call too. In 1963, the Soviet Union's harvest failed, and Washington began negotiating a massive wheat sale to Moscow. Tino made the bet of his life. If American wheat was going to the Soviets, American vegetable oil had to be next, and whoever already controlled the oil would name the price. That's what cornering a market means. Buy enough of something and you stop being a trader. You become the price. So he bought the future. With borrowed money, cash secured by tanks of seawater, he piled into futures contracts through more than 20 brokerage houses. 2 were in deepest, Ira Haupt and Company and Williston and Bean. Some days Tino bought more than $1 million of contracts before lunch, and Haupt was accepting Allied's warehouse receipts as collateral. American Express paper. Good as cash, remember. By that autumn, the position had gone from fraud to physics. De Angelis controlled most of the cottonseed oil futures on the New York Produce Exchange, by some counts 90% of the buying, and as much as a third of the soybean oil contracts in Chicago. Contracts covering 1.2 billion pounds of oil. Paper value, around $120 million. A hog butcher from the Bronx was now functionally the American vegetable oil market. And 1,200 miles away, in Omaha, Nebraska, a 33-year-old money manager was quietly going about his business. He ran a small investment partnership, and he read balance sheets for fun. He had no idea this bet was about to hand him the greatest investment of his life. We'll get to him. First, the crash. It all came apart in 5 days. Friday, November 15th, 1963. Washington. The Senate stalls the Soviet grain negotiations. The market reads the signal instantly. No Russian deal, no Russian oil sale. And vegetable oil prices sag. That same day, federal investigators from the Commodity Exchange Authority walk into Allied's offices, asking hard questions about the impossible size of Tino's positions. Now watch the machine run in reverse. Within 48 hours, soybean oil futures collapsed to around 7.6 cents a pound. Fractions of a cent. Sounds like nothing. But run the math the brokers ran that week. Every fraction of a cent, multiplied across 1.2 billion pounds. The losses compound by the hour. The margin calls go out. And understand what a margin call is at this scale. It is not a bill you can negotiate. It's cash delivered today, or your positions get liquidated into a falling market, which drives the market lower, which triggers the next margin call, a doom loop with a telephone attached. Ira Haupt alone is told to find another $14.1 million in cash immediately. Haupt calls Tino. Tino doesn't have it. He never had it. Tuesday, November 19th. Allied crude vegetable oil files for bankruptcy. And the instant Allied goes down, every lender holding an American Express receipt asks the same terrifying question at the same moment. Is the oil actually there? Inspectors descend on Bayonne, and this time they don't sample the top hatch and drive home. They open every hatch. They drain the tanks. Seawater, tank after tank after tank, hidden chambers, pipes rigged like a magic act, sludge. Of 1.8 billion pounds of certified collateral, barely 6% is ever accounted for. The rest was never oil at all. It was trust printed on paper. Wednesday, November 20th, the story hits the papers. And the New York Stock Exchange does something it has never done in its history. It suspends two member firms, Ira Haupt and Williston and Bean, because a single customer destroyed them. More than 20,000 ordinary investors wake up to frozen brokerage accounts. Their stocks, their cash, locked inside a dead firm. Thursday, November 21st. Haupt's hole has grown to $20 million. And exchange officials understand that this is no longer a brokerage problem. If 20,000 innocent customers can be wiped out by their broker's failure, why would anyone trust any broker? This is now a confidence problem, the kind that starts runs. And then comes Friday. November 22nd, 1963. Exchange officials spend that Friday morning in emergency session, hunting for a way to rescue Haupt's 20,000 customers before the fear spreads. The floor is jumpy by lunchtime, rumors everywhere. Then, at about 20 minutes to 2, New York time, the wire services flash a bulletin from Dallas. The president has been shot. In the next 27 minutes, the Dow drops 24 points as 2.6 million shares are dumped in a blind panic. The exchange shuts itself down 83 minutes early, the only way to stop the bleeding. And here's the strange mercy of history. The salad oil swindle, a scandal that should have owned America's front pages for months, simply vanishes into the national grief. Monday's papers had one story, and it wasn't this one. There is no room in a morning country for a story about vegetable oil. But the crisis didn't pause for the funeral. The markets couldn't stay closed forever. And if they reopened with 20,000 accounts still frozen and a member firm dead on the floor, grief could curdle into a full financial panic. The exchange was staring at the nearest miss in its modern history. So while the country buried its president, exchange officials and bankers worked through that weekend in quiet offices above emptied streets, building something that had never existed before, a rescue for the customers of a failed brokerage. No playbook, no fund, no law requiring any of it. They improvised it over a funeral weekend. By the time trading resumed, the plan was in place. The panic never came. And most Americans never learned that any of it, the seawater, the frozen accounts, the all-night arithmetic, had ever happened at all. So, the bill. More than $180 million gone, call it $1.9 billion in today's money, spread across 51 companies. To stop the contagion, the New York Stock Exchange did something unprecedented. It reached into its own members' pockets to pay back another firm's customers. The assessment on member firms came to somewhere on the order of $10 to $12 million by most accounts, with total support estimates running higher. And Haupt's 20,000 customers were made whole, the first customer bailout in the exchange's history. Hold that idea for 7 years and it becomes federal law. The same principle, protect the customer when the broker dies, returned in 1970 as SIPC, the protection that now stands behind every brokerage account in America. That shield exists in part because of salad oil. American Express stared into the abyss. Its warehousing subsidiary held $130,000 in assets against $210 million in claims. Read those numbers again. Legally, Amex could have let the subsidiary burn and walked away. Plenty of advisors said exactly that. But here was the real question on the boardroom table. Is American Express a company that stands behind its paper only when the law requires it to? The stock cratered anyway, down by more than a third, by some accounts nearly half. Instead, CEO Howard Clark made the decision that saved the company. The name was worth more than the money. American Express negotiated with the creditors and paid tens of millions to settle, roughly $60 million by the most common account, to keep the one asset no balance sheet could list. The promise, our paper's good. And one man, exactly one, understood in real time what that promise was worth. Because 1,200 miles from Wall Street, that 33-year-old money manager had been reading about the scandal. And then he did something nobody on Wall Street thought to do. He stopped reading and went to look. His name was Warren Buffett. While the market dumped American Express stock, Buffett stood near cash registers in Omaha, restaurants, drugstores, and watched. And what he saw was nothing. Nothing changed. Travelers' checks still sold. Nobody had stopped using the card. The scandal had burned the balance sheet. It hadn't touched the brand. Investors call this scuttlebutt. Go past the filings and check the real world. Buffett was doing it at a lunch counter. Wall Street was pricing a company in disgrace. Omaha was showing him a company nobody had stopped trusting. So Buffett bet the firm $13 million, 40% of everything his partnership had, into American Express for about 5% of the company. Within roughly 2.5 years, the stock was up 124%. Notice what he actually did. Everyone else read the paper. Buffett checked the tanks. The exact failure that created this fraud, trusting paper over product, was the failure he refused to repeat. It made him a fortune, and it laid a foundation stone of the greatest investing career in history. And Tino, he pleaded guilty, 20-year sentence, served about 7, and walked out in 1972. By 1975, he was at it again, running a Ponzi scheme out of Indianapolis, this time in hogs. He died quietly in Florida in 2009 at 93, having outlived nearly everyone he fooled. Which leaves one piece of unfinished business. Remember the phone call? 1960, 3 years before the collapse, an anonymous voice tells American Express, flat out, "The tanks are full of water. Inspectors drive to Bayonne, climb the ladders, drop their tubes through the one hatch Tino built for them, and go home satisfied." More than $100 million of this fraud hadn't even happened yet. One honest look inside one tank would have stopped all of it. Nobody looked, and by now you know why. Everyone in the chain was being paid not to look. The banks had their interest. American Express had its fees. The brokers had their commissions. The inspectors had their second salary. The paper was profitable, so the paper was believed. That's the lesson of the tanks at Bayonne. And 63 years on, it hasn't aged a day. Collateral is only as real as the person who checks it. Every case in this ledger ends the same way. Someone finally opens the second hatch. If you want the next case file when it opens, subscribe. The Con Ledger, case number 1, closed.